So, I'm not usually up on fashion trends, but over the past few years, I've noticed this one kind of t-shirt has gotten really popular. They're just normal-looking t-shirts, usually dark-colored, but they have a list of names on the front in white font. Usually about 4 or 5 names, all in Helvetica, one name per line with an ampersand in between. Have you seen them? Some of you, maybe? Yeah. So I've seen some listing Joey and Chandler and Monica and Phoebe and Rachel and Ross, or John and Ringo and Paul and George. So of course those are referencing the TV show Friends and the Beatles. But often I see them and they're more political. Sojourner and Harriet and Ida and Asada, or Douglas and Du Bois and Washington and King. So some of these t-shirts are kind of a hipster fashion statement, so obscure that most of us would have no clue what they are referencing. It's an inside language for fans of a particular band or TV show. But on the other hand, there are some that are a way of claiming an identity that connects that person with a particular lineage, particular histories, and they're, in a way, telling the stories of those histories with that person's wearing. So who would be on your t-shirt? If you had to choose 4 people who shaped you and the way and that you want the world to know about them. Likely it would be hard to narrow it down to 4. And in some ways, the tension in our country today is over who should be on our collective t-shirt. Is it, as might have been assumed in some circles a century ago, George, John, Thomas, and Abraham, meaning Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Lincoln? Or maybe it should be Susan and Martin and Caesar and Harvey, as in Susan B. Anthony, Martin King, Cesar Chavez, and Harvey Milk. Now, of course, no list of 4 people could ever satisfy the diverse constituencies that make up this nation. And even if we tried the same exercise here in the church, as the preacher to the Hebrews does in a way, there would be arguments. Should it be Abraham and Moses and Jacob and Jeremiah? Or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? What about Sarah and Miriam and Ruth and Mary? I mean, should we, as a country or a community, be able to agree on who the heroes of our collective histories are? What time period should we focus on? What are the criteria? What professions or areas should these people affect? And of course, what sorts of behavior would get you voted off this list? We've seen this play out in the public square quite a bit lately, from conversations about Thomas Jefferson's ownership of enslaved people, to contemporary public figures, everyone from Bill Cosby to opera star Placido Domingo this week, being accused of sexual misconduct. What happens when the people we look up to are not heroes to other people, but in fact quite the opposite? Why does it have this effect of inducing shame or sending us into an identity crisis, at least collectively, if not personally, when the people that we have put on a pedestal let us down? Now, of course, the central problem of narrowing down a list of 4 is that any time you name heroes, you exclude others. Some of this is a result of our own personal priorities, identities, heritage, education, and the like, and some of it is a result of the power imbalance that has been a persistent feature of human history. This summer, on our trip with the high schoolers, we went to a new memorial that has been built by the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. This memorial honors over 4,000 people who were victims of lynching from the period following the Civil War through 1950. The memorial structure at the center of the site is constructed of over 800 steel monuments, one for each county in the United States where racial terror lynchings took place, engraved with the names of the victims. Standing in front of these steel beams, you are confronted with the overwhelming number of names and haunted by the stand-in anonymous for those who remain unidentified. The memorial has another component, though, identical monuments that lay like coffins outside, waiting to be claimed by the counties in which the lynchings took place. serving as an invitation to locals of each place to learn those names, to correct the historical narrative that has in large part left this history unacknowledged. Their goal of disseminating these names, of getting the history to live not just in one place but in many, is a project to intervene not just in history but in the present. To know and see the history is to have a different understanding of the present and the future. That's why it matters whose names are on our metaphorical t-shirt, which stories we invoked as part of our heritage. The names that we know from history, the names that we choose as our personal and collective heroes, tell us who we are. The narrative of the past that we subscribe to tells us the direction of the future. And names left off, like those who are victimized by lynching, they obscure trust in our history, and they limit our imagination for the future. The preacher of this sermon to the Hebrews is speaking to people who were struggling with their Christianity. Persecution and pressure to conform to Roman and Jewish orthodoxy was real. But mostly, commitment to the Christian way was a threat to the total power of the Roman Empire. It's not a coincidence that the preacher draws from many stories about war, martyrdom, and death. This was the reality that many early Christians were faced with. And so to tell stories that didn't have to do with survival would not really have inspired that congregation. As contemporary Christians living in the U.S., where persecution is more often carried out by Christians than to someone because they are Christian, this list of names and the gruesome history the preacher tells is a little off-putting. But you can hear how conjuring up Daniel, who beats a lion in a fight, by conjuring up the Israelites who miraculously escaped enslavement, tells his listeners that they too will survive, that they too can endure hardship and persecution, and that their faith is the key to this survival. Faith meant not just a belief, an intellectual exercise, or a cultural affiliation, but an active willingness to risk their lives, or to be courageous for their own survival and the survival of their communities. The list of names in the book of Hebrews tells us that God acts through and in real people, in real history, but is not confined to each of these people, or even to the narrative that we have come to tell about them. It's curious that this preacher gives such a long list of people of faith and praises them for such contrary behaviors. On the one hand, for conquering foreign armies, and on the other, for getting killed by a foreign army. Lauds them for becoming administrators of justice, and also for wandering aimlessly in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. In other words, the preacher is saying, they weren't all heroes. When Toni Morrison passed away a week or so ago, many people wrote movingly about the impact her work had on them and on the world. One tweet that I saw struck me. It said, Toni Morrison got her first New York publishing job at 36, published her first book at 39. She was a single working mom who woke up every morning at 4 a.m. to write. What moved that person about Toni Morrison was not her majesty and mastery as a writer, or not only that, but her humanity, her ability to accomplish so much with so many obstacles, to launch an incredible career at an age that apparently at least some people think is beyond the expected window of success. And it was this tweet, as much as any quote from Morrison's incredible books, that seemed to speak to this little corner of the internet. We want heroes, but we also need humans. We need to see people who struggle as we do, who fail as we do. And sometimes that is as inspiring to us as soaring success. And despite the gruesomeness, the people lifted up in the sermon to the Hebrews, from Rahab to Jesus, are inspiring not because they were all successful or perfect, but because they lived into the calling of faith, to lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely. the calling to answer God's call, even with obstacles, reasons why not, our imperfections and our failures, to know that beyond the race to perfection, there is abundant joy. These people tell us, even in our day, that God doesn't care about greatness or success. God cares about allegiance to God and to God's people, a willingness to stand on the side of the persecuted, regardless the price. Our criteria for heroism, in other words, ought not to be fame or fortune, but humility and humanity. And when we reduce people, heroes of the past, and erase their struggles, we erase the complexities of life and of reality then or now. We turn these people from people into heroes and exemplars of a larger narrative. These competing narratives shape our collective ideas about who we are and where we're going. Do you side with the Founding Fathers t-shirt or the Freedom Fighters t-shirt? Even without a list of names, you can tell when someone wants to make an argument about which narrative of history is the right one. This week, Ken Cuccinelli, the acting director of USCIS, as I'm sure you heard, twisted the words of Emma Lazarus in her poem on the plaque of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired and your poor, who can stand on their own 2 feet and who will not become a public charge, he said. He was making an argument about the purpose of U.S. immigration policy to exclude those who would use public services. And many people, of course, were outraged that he would use these famous words that for so long have been used to make the argument that America should, in fact, be the refuge of those who need some support, that the wealth in this country has no higher purpose than to offer life and liberty to those who cannot find it elsewhere. And we saw the ramifications of these 2 narratives competing for acclaim on a highly visible symbol of this country, the Statue of Liberty. Now, the poem is not a fact, it's not a history book, it's an expression of an ideal and a sentiment. And the actual history is mixed. The U.S. has a long tradition of welcoming immigrants, fleeing poverty and political and religious persecution. The U.S. has a long tradition of shutting its doors to these same kinds of people. And often the difference between open and closed borders has been based on what country you come from, what religion you practice, your health, or your wealth. In 1790, the U.S. passed its first law about naturalized citizenship, which was that any free white person living in the U.S. at least 2 years could become naturalized. In 1882, the U.S. passed its first federal immigration law, which did 2 things: completely exclude anyone from China, and secondly, to screen all arriving immigrants, rejecting anyone who was, quote, a convict, lunatic, idiot, or person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. In the 1920s, the U.S. began a system of quotas, allowing entrance to only a set number of people from each country, and completely excluding those from certain countries. The story that the U.S. is a nation of immigrants is true in some ways. It's also true that the U.S. has always enacted policy which excludes, and excludes some more than others. In the public square this week, politicians and pundits have competed for which history will prevail in setting the course for our future. But the question for us is, how do we as people of faith enter into these conversations? What does the history of our own faith have to do with the history of our country? What do the stories and the histories that we tell about ourselves and our communities say about our God? The preacher of our text today points his people towards the cloud of witnesses. The long list of faithful ones of the past has not been the defining event, but rather a part of an ongoing unfolding of history, of which his listeners are invited to take part. We too are invited to be active agents in this race that is set before us. If lists of people are made to be bound in history books, worn on t-shirts and quoted in speeches, a cloud of witnesses is so broad that it cannot be pinned down, confined to something so ephemeral and fallible. A cloud of witnesses surrounds us, urging us to join them in that eternal search for something better which God has promised. That's something which will not happen, he says, apart from us. Not only does the cloud of witnesses urge us on and invite us in, but it makes room for multiple narratives, not needing to be confined to the linear shapes of our minds or our debates. How does lifting up this cloud of witnesses give us a way out of and beyond the narrow lines of political discourse? Can we as people of faith say something that breaks open the argument between we are a nation of immigrants and stop the invasion? Something that points out the hypocrisy of refusing to allow immigrants access to social services while also raiding the workplaces where they seek to earn livings, but also tells the truth about the less than perfect history of inclusion and acceptance in our country. Something that leaves room for the stories of people who aren't immigrants, who are native or whose ancestors were stolen from their homelands. That makes room for stories of people who have argued that we need not follow the narrow lines of history, but urge us to break out of those boundaries. The cloud of witnesses carries history from the past into the future. It takes an imperfect history and seeks a more perfect future. The cloud of witnesses can carry heroes and anti-heroes. Just as real clouds provide shade on a hot day and unleash rain that sends us running for cover. The cloud of witnesses does not define us, but rather it encourages us to define ourselves, sharing their examples and lessons from which to learn. The cloud of witnesses is not made up of saints, but fellow seekers. Earlier this week, Jewish people honored their holy day, Tisha B'Av, which marked the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem and is traditionally a day of collective mourning. Well, this year, many Jewish activists honored that day through protest, gathered in front of federal courts and ICE centers across the country, protesting concentration camps and family separations and deportations. They told the story of their history through a demand on the present. And a t-shirt bearing 4 words was worn by one participant, Rabbi Arthur Waskow. It read, "Resisting tyrants since Pharaoh." May it be so.